let me very briefly introduce the panel. To my left, we have Marko Blagojevic, who is currently a director of Bell and Brook, which is a project management consultancy. But even more importantly than that, Marko spent a lot of time within the government of Serbia dealing with at the front line, I think, with the consequences of disasters, particularly flooding, and then went on to run the public investments organization as well. So we'll be picking up on some of those things. To Marko's left, we have Alexandru Chavarot, who is an expert in climate finance. He's the founder and principal of Climate Finance 2050, his own company. So he looks at how to get finance into green projects, dealing with sustainability, biodiversity, also a lot of experience with insurance markets and insurance providers as well, which we will be picking up, I think. Next to Alexandra, we have Sasha Nyagul, who I think probably doesn't need any introduction, but I will introduce her anyway. She is, of course, a founding partner of Sustineri Partners, the organizers of this fantastic event. Without Sasha and Biljana, we would not be here, so thank you to them. But Sasha does more than that. She is also Managing Director, Global Head of Sustainability Real Estate at DWS Group, and has also advised CBRE Investment Management on sustainability as well. Fantastic experience. And last but not least, we have Christopher Sheldon, who is a colleague of Muga's here, and he is the World Bank Country Manager for Bosnia and Herzegovina and Montenegro, so a lot of experience in the region, but also a long history in the mining sector as well. And we will not reach net zero without mining and extractives, which is an interesting thing we might pick up on as well. I'm Jim Coleman. I am Head of Economic Advisory at WSP. We are a large global engineering-led professional services advisor. I'm also a professor in the School of Architecture and Cities at Westminster University. This is my second time at ESG Adria, and I'm very grateful to Biljana for inviting me back. I must have been okay last time. She asked me to come back. So, fantastic panel. So let's get stuck into some questions. Is this working? Yes, it is. Fantastic. Okay. Just a little anecdote, if I may, before I ask you to respond. Last weekend, I live in London. I live in southwest London, in the suburbs. I have a house with a garden. Not everyone in London has a garden. I feel very privileged. I have a garden, so I look after it. And last weekend, I watered my garden. I got the hose out, and I watered my garden. It's the beginning of April in London, and I'm watering my garden because it's so dry, because it hasn't rained for almost a month in London. In London today, it's 22 degrees Celsius. This weather we have here is London weather. We've got Montenegro's weather. You guys have got London's weather. And I talk to people, and they say, this is fantastic weather. It's sunny every day. The sky's blue. The world's miserable, so thank goodness we have this weather. My response is, this is the wrong weather. This is not the weather we should be having. If it's like this in April, what's it going to be like in July? What's it going to be like next July? And I get the feeling that people do not look ahead and think about the consequences of climate change and the need to adapt. And it's still so intangible. It's still so kind of existential. Marko, let me ask you about your frontline experience in Serbia of dealing with catastrophic floods a decade ago now. And tell us what has been the learning or the development following that experience? Do people have a different mindset now about the reality of climate? And also practically, has it led to new ways of thinking about financing either mitigation or, more importantly, adaptation?
You said that people do not look forward. They do not even look back.
Okay.
At least not some of them. We've had catastrophic floods in 2014, which has prompted actually a huge change in the way the government thinks and the government acts. It hasn't affected too much of a change, in a way of change, in a way that people think and people act. For instance, in 2014, we've had 30,000 plus families forced out of their homes. And you would think that this would prompt people to consider at least insurance of their homes against floods. It didn't. The government has reacted promptly and has provided government aid in a swift fashion after the floods in 2014. But I would hate to think that the government's swift action and the fact that the government has provided aid to flood-affected families has actually made them not think about what they themselves could do to help themselves. The government's way of acting and thinking has changed, though. 2014 floods were catastrophic, but they were not the last floods that we've had. And those are flash floods. We've had floods in 2016 and 18 and 19 and 20 and 21 and 22 and 23. Not nearly as catastrophic as those 2014, but nevertheless. The government started providing aid quickly and doing the work in way of reconstruction relatively fast after the floods in 2014. However, more importantly, the government swiftly shifted its focus toward prevention. And only 6 months after the floods, Serbia has adopted its first national program for disaster risk management. And after that, the action plan for disaster risk management, a completely new law on reconstruction. A few years after that, a completely new and the first ever law on disaster risk and crisis management. We have been assisted greatly by our development partners from the international community, the World Bank, the EU, and the UN. And this has also prompted considerable investments into preventive infrastructure in response, because preventive infrastructure needs time to be planned, designed, and built. And while you're working to implement structural measures, you need to implement non-structural measures, strengthen the capacity of the response of the part of the government responsible for response in order to be able to react swiftly and assist both people and property and infrastructure that is still exposed to the risk of floods. We've had considerable investments into preventive infrastructure between mid-60s and mid-80s, and then the governments have given up on it. And this neglect has been going on for almost 30 years, and the floods in 2014 have actually changed the way the government both thinks and acts. And this is something that I'm most proud of.
Okay, great. Has it also resulted in new approaches to financing adaptation?
It has. There are instruments that are available. If the governments cannot, and they most often cannot, mobilize swiftly considerable resources from national budgets, from contingency budgets, for example, there are available resources, and one being World Bank's catastrophe deferred drawdown option is the most useful instrument. I do not believe that many can praise the World Bank for being flexible and swift.
It's the one instrument.
However, I believe that when you take a look at how this, how the CAT DDO, all the circumstances surrounding CAT DDO, it's perhaps the best instrument. It comes with a lot of prior action that is expected. It is, after all, a development policy law on DPL, which means that there are some policy changes that you need to make, some prior actions that you need to take. But all these prior actions, all these policy changes are aimed at strengthening your capacity, institutional capacity, structural capacity to be more resilient to future, to existing risks.
Yeah.
But not only to existing risks, that's not enough. What you do needs to be risk-informed, as well as it needs to be climate change-informed. That's why we have worked to put into place a disaster risk registry, to put into place a climate digital atlas that does projections on climate change over the period of next few decades, taking into consideration all the measurements, since the measuring started back some 70 plus years ago in Serbia, takes into consideration everything that has happened and also does the projections of what will happen. This would need to be built into any future infrastructure project because any future disaster can render considerable investments meaningless, leaving them exposed to risk of either floods or earthquakes or forest fires or whatever the risks are that Serbia is or has been exposed to. Landslides as well. 1/3 of the territory of the country is under the risk of landslides. Over 30,000 landslides have been registered in the cadastre that we did, the cadastre of landslides. So we have everything that it takes to have a risk-informed and also climate change-informed design on any future infrastructure project.
Okay, great. Thank you, Marco. You're quite positive. That's good. Okay, good.
I'm saying that we're well equipped.
Okay, very good. Okay. Alexander, you are a green finance expert. When I take part in panel discussions and all sorts of things about climate finance, the discussion is always along the lines of it's hugely expensive to deal with climate, with mitigation or adaptation. Governments cannot fund everything, nor should they fund everything because there's so much private finance available. We're awash with institutional finance and all sorts of things, and it just needs to find its way into green projects. I suspect a lot of it is finding its way into mitigation rather than adaptation. Okay, we'll come on to that. But as a finance expert, how do you see this? What do you think there's enough of an enabling environment to allow funding to be deployed into the right kinds of interventions to deal with climate?
Thank you, Jim. That's indeed a very interesting question, because just to set the scene, and I hope I won't be contradicted by my World Bank colleagues, but the relative share of finance going to mitigation, various adaptation, is about 1 to 10.
Yeah.
Right. At least in non-OECD countries. But the needs are probably, I don't know the exact ratio, but the inverse. So how do you make that jump? And I think you set the scene as well in terms of determining what governments should do, in terms of setting the frameworks, in terms of funding themselves or preparing for contingent funding, as we heard earlier, versus what the private sector should mobilize is also critical. And so I started looking at climate from a finance point of view about 20 years ago, and obviously in those days it was all about renewable energy. And 10 years on, I realized actually renewable energy is easy. You need, a decent bankable regulatory regime. You need credit-worthy counterparties. You need, good technology. You need a lowering of what's called the levelized cost of electricity. But all that has happened or is happening. The cost of solar panels is reduced by 90% in the past 15 years, right? Yeah. Solar and wind coupled with battery is probably getting now cheaper than most other form of energy in most parts of the world. So we're there. There's still a lot that needs to happen to scale it up and to ensure that when we talk about the energy transition, it's actually an energy addition of renewable energy components compared to hydrocarbons, and that needs to be accelerated. But the real question now, at least from when I look at this, is how to mobilize finance for adaptation. So I think there's 5 things that need to happen. And by the way, I also want to emphasize that to me, climate adaptation, physical climate risk, it's no longer an ESG topic. It's actually a value preservation and enhancement topic. Unless we do something about it, the value of the infrastructure stock globally is going to decrease significantly. What was described in terms of changes to climate patterns is in a way the new normal. And the bad news is that it's only going to get worse. So, we need to work within that framework. So the 5 areas to focus on are the establishment of standards around adaptation and resilience across different asset classes, particularly in infrastructure. Second, develop and use metrics to quantify resilience and be able to compare good investment versus a less good investment. Third, as was mentioned in Mega's presentation, is beginning to have cost-benefit frameworks around the quantification of both the cost but also the benefits. Yep. And then how do you allocate them? How do you monetize them? Which is not easy, as was implied. I think fourth, it's about risk transfer. Yeah. What should public versus private sector absorb or be exposed to the risks? What's the role of the insurance markets? One anecdote, I don't know if you recall, but a few years ago, the then president of the French insurance company AXA said, we don't know how to insure a 4-degree world. So we're not there, hopefully, and hopefully we'll never get there, but we're on a path towards a worsening of the situation. And so if the insurance industry says we don't know how to insure it, that means that it becomes a public policy / public good issue. And so having intelligent risk transfer mechanisms and embedding them into solutions is important. And the fifth thing is, therefore, mobilizing finance for resilience, both governments, and you mentioned it in terms of government funding the capacity to absorb risks, but also the capacity to respond to post-disaster events, and then the capacity to reconstruct. But governments can't do everything. Governments are under very severe sovereign debt constraints around the world, and so they're not the answer. Right? The money doesn't sit with government. The money sits with institutional investors, with pension funds, with insurance firms, with sovereign wealth funds. So it's getting money from these institutions into investments in adaptation, which I think is critical.
Yeah, and just on this kind of cost-benefit framework, who's the recipient of that analysis, and who's making the case? Is it government somehow facilitating the case to the private sector, or is it the other way around?
Well, I think it's both. The issue, though, is maybe the two don't talk to each other enough. To give you two examples, I'm advising an international organization based in India called the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. It's quite a mouthful, CDRI. And they are indeed developing frameworks. They call it countries' financial resilience frameworks, where the member countries can then see what they need to do to improve on their resilience journey. And so they have put in place what they call a Global Infrastructure Resilience Index, which essentially measures the vulnerability of a country infrastructure stock to climate risks. And that translates into expected damages, which the insurers will call annual average losses. And so making a link between investing in resilience and the reduction of these expected losses, I think, is a first step to making the case for this. Yes. Second, on the private sector side, I also work with an organization in London called the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, which, as its name indicates, puts together various institutional investors who exchange views on climate risks. And they're developing what they call a Climate Resilient Infrastructure Framework, investment framework, CRIF. That's coming out in the next 2 months, I think. And again, that is a way to try and embed physical climate risk considerations and investment tools into climate adaptation.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes, I'm coming to you, Sasha, and I do have a particular question for you, but why don't you respond to this topic first?
That's exactly, I'm sorry to sort of override your question, but it's such an interesting thing, and I'm actually part of the same organization, IGCC, sort of as co-chairing the real estate committee, and I want to just tack on what Alexander was saying about private finance, because that's where I am. I work for institutional investors. And the question is, how do you get, they own the world, right? They have the money. Yeah. But, they need to look at investment by investment and make that case. Why is this going to actually bring the returns that we need to bring for the pension funds to be able to pay the pensions, right? So the risk aversion is high, so it needs to be something that makes sense. And I'm mostly in the real estate world, so looking at a 10 years lifespan, right? And I have debates. Why are we still investing in Florida housing? Well, people still want to live there. Insurance is still there. So an insurance says, well, we're insuring for 1 year, it's a state insurance anyway, so, the numbers stack up. We need to stop the numbers stacking up. We need to put the risk properly into the valuation. It's not in there.
Yep.
Especially it's not in there for insidious risks, so I prefer to call them rather than chronic. These sort of heat, the heat waves are going to be longer. Are the, houses here prepared for that? Some are, but most are not. And then you have everybody putting ACs on and the electricity system goes down. So it's a systemic weakness that is not priced in. They just look at, well, for how much can we rent this property? That is our rental income, great. Well, can we sell it? Well, the buyer is still not pricing in properly the risk. We can sell it.
Yeah.
We don't care. It's brutal, right? Even if it's a pension fund that should be thinking about the long term, the motivation of an asset manager and a portfolio manager will be within the life cycle of that asset within their portfolio. And I think, so either from a regulatory perspective, changing systems, metrics, I have just done an audit of my entire global portfolio, not mine, the one that I take care of, 80 billion euros, everywhere around the world, looking at, okay, well, what is the climate risk? And the tools that the industry normally uses are the ones that look at exposure. But this is the exposure, and that's where we stand. I will tell you that the tools that we used showed me during Los Angeles wildfires that we don't have risk of wildfires in Los Angeles. So these tools tell you wrong things, right? So you need to triangulate and see what is actually true. But then you need to look at what kind of asset you have. Okay, well, you have a drought risk. Are you actually operating a senior housing, or are you operating a self-storage? Self-storage, I really don't care. It can still operate. I have to think like that, right? I'm going to invest in senior housing for resilience measures in there. And then you look at, well, is this asset resilient? As much as, is it enough? What is enough? Because the risk will remain. So what is then a resilient asset that I still want to invest in? Are the measures sufficient for me to keep hold of that asset? And the European taxonomy has finally put kind of a wake framework. There is the European Commission guidebook about adaptability of buildings and resilience in Europe, which is useful. But there isn't a common understanding across all of the pension funds in the world and asset managers in the world of what is acceptable level of risk and what is a resilient real estate asset, and how do you price it in? It is still not there, and that is a big blocker.
Okay, let's come back. I think we'll come back to some of these points. Something specific I wanted to ask you, because you're a trained architect and expert in the built environment. Going back to one of Mega's comments about the nature of urban development in the region. So we have the largest cities are getting bigger, but a lot of the smaller cities, they're getting smaller in population terms, but they're spreading out, which is not good for all sorts of things. What do we need to do then to try and encourage a better form of urban development in the region, to take account of some of these issues, but also to be more resilient, to be better able to adapt, and just to be kind of better places, better place for economic and social well-being?
Well, my favorite example of that is Copenhagen, which did an amazing job. I mean, they had a catastrophic flood in the city, and they said, well, okay, obviously we can't displace the city is there, it's sort of home to millions of people. But they have done this immense program of transforming communal places, urban places, into fantastic places to be, so the parks, but with inbuilt climate shocks and flood shocks, resilience measures, right? Everything from urban heat islands, but also from flooding and so on. They have motivated further development in a smart way. You first need to run the infrastructure, and there was a talk earlier today about how much infrastructure development is needed, and that's prerequisite for people to come and to enjoy places. And then we all know that it's a common sense. But they made it so that getting to the certain place in the city is easy. You have sustainable transport. It is, they've built in all the resilience that's needed, and then the private capital will come in and the place will flourish. Yeah. But I really like how they have integrated these measures with public places as well. We have in this region a little bit of a habit of paving everything, and every time I see a green area in my home city of Belgrade lost, I mourn. Maybe there is a use for it for whatever, demonstrations, perhaps these days. But it increases the urban heating, and it increases the risk of flooding, so it's making it less resilient. And that's, we have to think about the entire picture, the entire system, how it's going to work in different scenarios, and then develop.
Copenhagen, interesting example. A lot of people would say, okay, this is a very sophisticated city, and the municipal authority has a lot of capacity, a lot of capability. How long will it take for municipal authorities in this region to get to that kind of situation?
I would hate to predict that. This is a completely different region, so I had you asked me for what's, my favorite, I gave a favorite example. Of course, it's not exactly the same, but there are examples, and, I think Porto Montenegro did a good job at integrating life with the development and sort of thinking about things, and that did sort of interrogate them about the resilience measures, and they do actually have them in place, both for heat waves and for droughts and so on and so on. So, that's easier for new development. What do you do with the existing, tower blocks in New Belgrade? How do you fix all of that? There are some examples. There are funding schemes, including World Bank, to help with these projects. But it's going to be much. I'm not going to lie. It's going to be a much more difficult task. So there's no easy answer.
Okay, but the World Bank, I'm sure, can help. So coming to Christopher. Tell us, Christopher, about the kinds of investments that you're making in the region, and how, as an IFI, you're trying to act as an enabler of systems, whether they're governance systems or financial systems, to look at everything to do with climate, really, both the mitigation side and the adaptation side, although we're more interested in adaptation. And when do we get to the point where things are starting to work so well that the World Bank can just withdraw and the system works perfectly?
That'll be very, very nice. We'll gladly pull away at that point. But I think there'll be different challenges that we may face. But the World Bank actually has a commitment to spend about 45% of its financing on climate-related activities, and that's fairly broad definition, but we call it climate co-benefits, and all the IFIs follow a similar methodology. And last year we spent, I think it was around 42.6 billion was on climate activities. So it's a significant part of our investment, but it's these investments also really make a lot of sense. So particularly in this region, a few examples. So we have a regional project with Serbia, Montenegro, and Bosnia-Herzegovina on the Sava-Drina River basin. So after the big floods in 2014, we did have some specific flood protection projects, and I think that may have been some of the impetus for some of the things in Serbia, Bosnia similarly. We just had one of our staff was up in the northwestern part of Bosnia, and somebody remembered them working on that project and came and thanked them because when they had the recent heavy rains, they didn't experience flooding. So it's always nice when you get somebody from community coming and telling you and thanking you for your project. That's sort of a human example, but there's also a big economic loss, because the big floods that happened last year. I think we did a rapid remote assessment, so it's not a perfect assessment, but it's pretty close to the government's assessment. Something like 150 billion euros of damages to infrastructure alone, not including the economic losses that would come because that infrastructure wasn't operating. So this Sava-Drina River project is largely around flood protection, but that's all around adaptation. And I think the challenge with adaptation, maybe why this 10-to-1 ratio happens, is you don't really know you need it until it's too late. And we've introduced a whole lot of new financing instruments to give that kind of flexibility. Yeah. So this catastrophic drawdown option, CAT-DDO, is a really good example, and It's fast dispersing, but it is that preparation time where it's still slow, where we have to set these things up. But once those triggers are met, then within a day you can get the money to deal with the problem. Because otherwise you scramble afterwards to try to assess the damage. And we have emergency procedures which can respond faster. But as Megha sort of pointed out, every dollar invested today is going to save, on average, around four in the future. That's a really good investment, actually. You don't really get that in many other ways. But because you don't see the immediate impact in the same way you do with mitigation, where you're reducing pollution, etc., or air quality is improving, these things we sort of gravitate to them more. But the cost of adaptation is really an investment that will save you money. So, in addition to those sort of physical investments, we're really trying to incorporate it into all of our lending, and then to equip governments with their own, or sort of improve their abilities to better incorporate adaptation also into their investments, to look at climate risk. And that's true for agriculture projects, it's true for water. Water's a really good example. Here in Montenegro, we did a water security assessment, and we found that the spring, which actually provides water to most of this region, is reducing its capacity. Now, we don't know exactly why. It could be because of the gravel mining in the main river that's lowering the riverbed. It could be just because of climate change. Hydrology is complex. We don't exactly know why, but we know it's reducing. It rains a lot here, but because of the structure of the rocks here, the water it doesn't get retained. It just runs through. So this region depends on water coming from the other side of the mountains. So the government's taking that very seriously. They're investing in short-term measures to ensure water supply, but also looking long-term about how do they protect the water systems in the country to ensure that water supply is going to be there. So I think that knowledge came about because of our study, our analytical work, but government's really taken it up. But what we want to do is to have governments really equipped to be able to make those decisions in the normal course of business, when they also evaluate investment decisions and to consider the climate risks in them. I'm not covering everything that we're doing, obviously, but even in terms of the financing, you asked about trying to mobilise other investment. I think that's one of the key things is the government investment, which is where our direct lending goes, is just one aspect, but creating the enabling environment for more private investment and encouraging that investment is actually where the bigger money is. Yep. And that's, there's multiple parts to that. I think having good project readiness for investors to come into is one part. Another is just in the evaluation processes and the regulatory environment that countries have, but also that institutional capacity within governments to be able to manage these things and to make good decisions on what to permit and what not to permit. But also, blending our finance together. It's where we can, the World Bank has longer terms than typically a commercial bank does. So if the World Bank or IFC, for example, IFC colleagues in the room, can come in and syndicate these loans and have slightly longer terms, that can also improve the bankability of some of these investments. Because as Megha pointed out, that we don't know exactly when things will happen. We just know that we anticipate that they will, and they'll be more extreme. We don't know exactly when. So having that longer term time horizon financing that fits to that, I think is another good contribution that the World Bank and other IFIs can make.
Yep. Great. Just to go back to the point you made about institutions, so looking at financial instruments, looking at investment in physical adaptation, how important is it to invest in institutional capacity and capability, and how much of that do you do as the World Bank?
So in all of the investment loans that we do, we look at that institutional capacity, because that's quite honestly, that's the investment that's going to pay off much longer than our investment. So a typical World Bank project, a loan is around 5 to 7 years, and we always allocate a portion of those loans towards building the institutional capacity. Now, these are loans, so of course government doesn't want to borrow too much for that, because they like to see the physical infrastructure. It's also easier for a politician to show what was built in terms of physical asset rather than institutional capacity. But we always bring that into the mix because we think that's what's fundamental, as well as the reform aspects. That's new policy. So, we do policy lending as well as investment lending. So the CAT DDO is sort of a policy loan, but Recently here in Montenegro, we had a policy loan that was sort of half fiscal and half environment. New law on waste management, new law on forestry, new law on renewable energy. All of those things are key. And the next phase will have a law on climate change. So we're supporting those policies also, those reforms. So the reform angle as well as the institutional capacity angle, that provides that longer term benefit beyond the life of the physical investments that we finance.
Fantastic. I'm just looking at the clock ticking away here. So I'm going to try and go round one more round of questions. So let's try and be succinct. I'll try and be succinct as well. Marco, coming back to you, and again, your experience of dealing with climate-related events. We're in a region with multiple countries, all adjacent to each other, relatively small. The geographies are quite tight, and it's a shared experience. Climate crisis, it's a shared experience. What about collaboration across boundaries, across borders? Is that strong enough?
There has to be cooperation. Otherwise, the isolated actions of one country can only reach as far. If you share a river basin or a river, you share the risk of floods. If you share a tectonic plate, you share a risk of earthquakes. If you share a coast in countries that are exposed to risk of tsunamis, you share a risk of tsunamis. And if there is no information sharing between the countries, then the effect of what you do can only reach as far. However, in order to share the information, you need to have them first. This is where I think that a platform that would be set up, or an existing platform that could be used for this information sharing purposes, would benefit the entire region. There is one platform, the DPPI, Disaster Preparedness and Prevention Initiative, that's headquartered in Sarajevo. It has been set up way back with the support of the Pact for the Stability of Southeast Europe. But that doesn't do nearly as much as it could or should. Countries should, and they could replicate what Serbia has done in a way of collecting the information on existing risks and collecting the information on weather events over the past decades and using them for projections of what's going to happen over the next decades. This can be used as an example of it, as a sort of a best practice example. That's one thing. The other thing, there has to be an information sharing platform on what country does in terms of structural measures. Because if you're managing the water course upstream, then whatever you do affects me. If a country invests into improving preventive infrastructure upstream, then I should know that I should be expecting larger quantities of water coming my way. But I do not believe that it does exist in a random manner, but it doesn't exist in a systematic, in an organized manner. I believe that an initiative of this for the platform, information sharing platform should be set up, or an existing one should be equipped to do that as well as whatever their original mandate was or is.
This is an area for further policy development,
Absolutely.
I think. Alexandra, just insurance markets are critical to looking at risk and resilience. And just on the point about information and data, and there was a very interesting panel yesterday discussing AI as a kind of generator of data and information to feed into climate-related policy. What's your view on kind of immediate next steps, perhaps in how we might look at data and the generation of it for insurance markets and decision-making?
So I think it's a bit like comparing ESG ratings. You get 5 answers for every 3 providers you ask, right?
Yeah. It's like getting an insurance quote.
And I'm slightly exaggerating, but the other thing is that this is a bit of a black box, climate data. And so I think there is a need to make it more transparent, more understandable, and to correlate it. There are initiatives. I mentioned the CDRI one. I think the private sector insurance market is working on this. They're actually grouping together to determine and define resilience metrics together with the UNDR agency. I'm a senior advisor with a UK-based insurer called Howden and their climate risk and resilience team. That's something that is very much top of their agenda. Just making the link between climate data and what you were mentioning, Marco, I see here in the region an opportunity to create some sort of risk pool whereby the countries of the Balkan could together allocate, with perhaps some World Bank funding and other public funding, a bit of capital to pay for premiums that would then buy insurance to be triggered as and when certain events materialize. And that could be done on a regional basis and probably much more effective than a single country doing it. So I think working with the insurance industry to understand the data, to predict in some ways what could happen, because it's both the probability of events, but it's also the severity of events. So you have two distribution curves that don't meet each other and that we're all collectively trying to make sense of. Right? It's much more complicated, in some ways much more interesting than quantifying the CO2 emission reductions. That's very easy, right? And so that can only be done in a sort of collective and cooperation manner.
Okay, great, thank you. Sasha, thinking about real estate developers, the development community of the region, what do we need to do to get that community to a state of sophistication where the kinds of things we're discussing become, the kind of daily thinking in terms of how to make investments in real estate?
I might tag on again on Alex. So he was mentioning, these tools and translating really complex matter into simple metric, right? And not having 15 metrics that all mean something different. So the real estate industry has benefited in recent times from a tool called CREM. It's Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor. It's an EU-funded project, which gave every single asset manager and asset owner the same metric. Whether it's, a Bible or not, it doesn't matter, but if every single one of us are using the same metric to look at what is the stranding event for the asset. And the stranding event means theoretically that you can't rent or sell your asset because it's too carbon and energy intense. Such a tool doesn't exist for resilience, for physical climate risk. This is transitional. For physical, it doesn't exist. I asked the makers of CREM, why don't you make one for physical risk? And well, we did something, and then Munich Re took it, and it sort of got privatized, and it's gone. I think that's what we need. We need a free source, because CREM is free source. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, but it needs to be one metric, one simple, taking all of the complexity underneath and saying, well, this is your stranding point, and that's then I can easily explain to my asset managers who are not climate scientists and don't, whatever. I can explain it to my portfolio managers. You can explain it to a retail investor, what is the stranding risk of this portfolio, and they can understand it as a simple metric, and it means the same across all of the various funds. That is the thing, at the moment everybody's using something different, and you can't compare and you can't decide, and then it doesn't get valued, and nothing happens. So I would say if it's one thing, that would be one meaning, one definition.
Okay, fantastic. I've got a question for Christopher, which I'm then going to ask everyone coming back in the last 3 minutes, so very quickly. When we look at what's happening globally, geopolitically, particularly in the United States at the moment, let's not get into tariffs, but we see a retreat from the climate agenda. I think a gradual retreat from that. Well, it's not a gradual retreat, it's quite an obvious retreat. Is this the discussion we're having now, which is about the realities of how you value assets and avoid stranded assets and build valuation into the future? Is that the reality of this? Is that one way of combating this desire to retreat from climate as an issue? Because it's a real thing, it's a real tangible financial thing. So therefore you need to take account of climate. Do you think that's a way of avoiding the retreat?
No, I think it is, because it's very concrete. I mean, when we talk about climate change in the World Bank, we're not just talking about it as climate change, we're talking about jobs, about good jobs, about green jobs, about air quality, about health, about disaster risk management, prevention, ensuring, adequate water supply. Also, I think we get to the same goals without making it something non-tangible, calling climate change. I think that's partially their problem, in that those that aren't really on board with dealing with climate change aren't necessarily convinced that the models that predict it will happen, for example. But we see consequences today of impacts of climate that are undeniable today, that have financial costs. We also see changes in the economy and jobs and things that are also undeniable in terms of opportunity. So I think by focusing on those things, we achieve the same climate goals without having to get into a debate about what's causing climate change and what will happen when. A little bit like the model Mega showed. Like I said, we don't know what things are going to happen when, but we know things are already happening now. We think they're going to continue to happen more in the future. So let's do something about it. That's a very sellable position. I think also for our clients, when we talk about climate change, they're on board with that because they see that tangibly. And I think that's a very convincing way to go, and in a way counters some of the concerns about climate change as a topic. So we're going to continue to do it because it makes good sense to our clients, good economic sense, good sense for the citizens of the countries that we support.
Fantastic. And a final comment each on this question, Sasha?
Very
in the last
quickly,
minute.
I have for a while not been using three-letter words in the US. I talk about efficiency and resilience, and that works.
Fantastic. Alexandre?
Absolutely. I mean, it echoes what I said at the beginning, right? It's about value preservation and enhancement.
Yeah.
I think there's two lenses through which to incorporate these, and that's through the impact of chronic climate risks into what's predictable. If you invest in infrastructure, it's adjusting cash flow forecast to take that into account in terms of reduced revenue, increased OPEX, for example. And then it's looking at the impact of acute risks, right? The flash floods, and other one-off events that are, as we heard earlier, more likely to happen at a higher, with an increased severity. What does that do to the assets and their valuation? And the asset managers, the board members, have a fiduciary duty to take this into account. Again, this is not about ESG, it's about value.
Yeah. Marco?
Yes. The reason why we're retrieving, some of the countries are retrieving or using as an excuse the fact that it may halt growth. It all depends on where you're starting from. In the region, for example, I believe that this agenda can actually boost growth through an increased use of locally sourced renewables, through biomethane, biomass, locally sourced, of course, geothermal. You can actually boost revenue, local revenue, you can boost job figures, you can boost the GDP, and actually work to reduce your foreign trade deficit, which means that you can only contribute in a positive manner to the local economy.
Okay, thank you.
If you're starting from where we are in the region at present.
Okay, great, thank you. I've made a fundamental error and not allowed any time for questions, in fact. I hope you'll forgive me because the panel was so good. I wanted to keep asking them questions myself, but I'm sure they'll hang around if anyone has any questions they would like to ask. Thank you again to Mega for the introductory presentation. It was fantastic. And please join me in thanking my panelists. Thank you very much.